What the heck?
Was a two-step process. Here we go. Okay, and we are live on YouTube. I'm going to let everybody in. Good evening, everyone. This is the Montgomery County Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We're just getting started. Off to a stumbling, mumbling start, but we're getting there. But please be patient. It takes a few minutes. Good evening. If you're just joining us, this is the Montgomery County Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We're just getting started. Takes a few minutes to let everybody in on Zoom. Welcome. Good evening, everyone. This is the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. We'll get started in just a minute or two. Okay, let's get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Matt Losack. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. A couple of operational details before we get going. First, if you have any questions or concerns, we ask you to put them in the chat. Our staff will get to them and our guests as we move along through the conversation. But again, put them in the chat. Tonight, we're going to discuss a couple of bills from two of our esteemed board members and state delegates who have been renter champions since long before they joined the board of directors of the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. One of them, Vaughn Stewart, has had a second baby, not he himself, but his family, and is doing bedtime duty, but will be joining us shortly. Let me quickly introduce the treasurer of the Renters Alliance Board of Directors, Josh Fisher. He is always here for moral support as well as to make sure the money is spent correctly. And also we have with us of my staff, Pat Beckham, Malek Demir, and David Mullins, who do our outreach and work with many of you on your cases and issues that you may have and guide you to available resources. And they will be monitoring the chat to make sure that questions and concerns are addressed as we go. And then, of course, we have with us tonight our esteemed board member and state delegate, Janelle Wilkins, who has been a champion for renters for as long as I've known her, and that's been a long time, and has been a real leader in Annapolis, not only representing renters, but representing Montgomery County and our community with a kind of strength and know-how that we haven't seen in a long time. So we're particularly grateful to Delegate Janelle Wilkins and honored to have her with us this evening to talk about what a piece of legislation the Renters Alliance has been working to get enacted in Annapolis for a long time, and that Delegate Wilkins has been championing and leading the struggle to get it passed. So with that, Delegate Wilkins, please, you have the floor.
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you. Hello to all of the Renters Alliance board and staff. And thank you so much, Executive Director Losack, for all of your leadership and work throughout the county. I'm proud to be a board member of the Renters Alliance of Montgomery County. Greetings to all the renters who are joining us today. We hope that we're able to provide you with some useful information. And I always, when I talk to renters, like to talk about the fact that empower, we build by collectively working together. When it's just one renter speaking up, that is good, but there is power in us coming together, forming alliances, and working together as one voice. That is something that a landlord hears and a property manager, and also us as elected officials. So I want to urge you to continue to tune in and to continue to advocate with us. I wanted to give everyone an update on a couple of bills in the legislature to let you know how we did this legislative session when it comes to renters' rights issues. We are in session as a legislature, the House and the Senate, for 90 days out of the year. That's January through April. So we just adjourned on April 10th. We have 90 days to get through about 2,500 bills that are introduced, to hold hearings on them, decide which ones will pass, which ones won't. And so we passed almost 1,000 bills this legislative session in those 90 days. Several of them were pro-renter bills. One of them that I want to mention, which was not successful this year, but is a really important bill, though, is the legislation that I introduced called Just Cause Eviction. If you've been on here before, if you've met me before, then you've probably heard about Just Cause Eviction. It's been a righteous, important fight, and there are many changes happening next year that will hopefully help us to get to victory. But what Just Cause Eviction is, it looks at the end of a lease. When I rented for about 12 years in downtown Silver Spring, you get to that moment, end of the year lease, and you wonder if that your landlord is going to renew your lease. What Just Cause Eviction says is that it allows jurisdictions to pass legislation like Montgomery County, Baltimore City, Prince George's County, to pass legislation to require landlords to provide a reason if they decide not to renew your lease. Matt and I were at an event at a renter building just this weekend where there was a renter who was a leader. He's been speaking up about various issues on the property. He's never paid his rent late, no violations, and he received a notice to vacate from his landlord for absolutely no reason. That does happen. And we want to make sure that doesn't happen, that a landlord has to provide a reason. So we urge you to continue to support that bill. I thank the Renters Alliance for continuing to support that with me as well. I also want to mention that one bill that was successful, and Delegate Stewart will talk about others, is legislation that requires a landlord to show proof of having an actual license as a landlord before they evict someone. A landlord in Montgomery County, not everywhere in the state, but in Montgomery County, is required to have a license. So imagine being evicted and someone filing to evict you, and they didn't even take this proper steps to have a license as a landlord. So we passed very critical legislation this session to ensure that our landlords have a license before they evict. So that's one that I did want to mention. And Delegate Stewart has a few others that he's going to flag when he is on, but I'm very happy to be here with you all tonight. And thank you, Matt, for the opportunity to share a little bit about the renter-related legislation that we led this session.
Thank you, Delegate Wilkins. Let me take some time, because I know you're modest and you've also been dealing with this legislation for so long that unfortunately a lot of people who work on this kind of thing think everybody understands it, but most people really don't. We do, but most people really don't. Just Cause right now, for not to scare the heck out of everybody on this call, but with just 60 days notice at the end of your lease, a landlord could say, we're not renewing. We're going to give you a notice to vacate. And if you stay one day longer than your lease allows, then you're what's called tenant holding over. You're holding over one day past the end of your lease. And the landlord can file to evict you for tenant holding over. When you go to court, the judge will only ask one question. Did you receive 60 days notice or more? And if the landlord can agree and prove that they gave you 60 days notice, there's no other requirement. You may know, as we know for this gentleman that we work with at the Enclave in Silver Spring, that he was a leading advocate for tenants. that he was a leader in the Tenants Association, that he brought to the attention of the management company numerous complaints about maintenance and poor service, all of which are true, by the way. The Enclave has been cited with more than 2,900 code violations in the last month, and the county is working on that. And yet he was leading, as is his right and his duty as a tenant activist, to tell that information to the landlord. But he received a 60-day notice to vacate, and the landlord does not have to say why when we know, we believe that the reason is retaliatory for his efforts. So for whatever reason, whether it's the color of your skin, your religion, where you come from, your immigration status, your renter activism, whether the property manager is making mistakes and you know it and you bring it to his or her attention, whatever it is, they can retaliate against you because there is no defense unless you can prove it, which is nearly impossible, unless we pass some kind of protection known as just cause, requiring a justifiable reason not to renew your lease. If we enact that legislation that Delegate Wilkins is championing, and we pass it local, then which enables every local municipality to pass it in any form that they want, by the way. But if we pass it here in Montgomery County, which we believe we will the moment it's authorized, that would require the landlord to automatically renew the lease unless they have a good reason not to. In no way does it say to tenants that you can't be evicted if you fail to pay your rent or if you break the law or do anything that any Judge Judy would think somebody should lose their home over. All of those reasons exist already. But they're required in this law to state what those reasons are. Otherwise, tenants like you and me and like Delegate Wilkins and everybody who rents their home throughout the state of Maryland is vulnerable to losing their home at the end of each lease. And if you're on month to month, every month you could receive a 60-day notice to vacate. So you're in constant threat. And we have seen, as we've seen this weekend, Delegate Wilkins was with us at a community meeting at the Enclave, but we see whole communities intimidated and afraid to speak up because they know that they could face eviction. And one thinks that this happens only to poor folks. It happens across the economic spectrum in this county. I know buildings on upper class buildings, we'll call them, over in Bethesda, Chevy Chase, where people are paying a good deal of money, but they retired and they sold their home and they moved into an apartment, lock, stock, and barrel, and they've been living there for a long time. And maybe they moved in their 70s and now in their 80s. And moving is not easy. I didn't like to move when I was in college, when I had to move from one dorm to the next. But imagine if your whole home and life is in your apartment, and now you're in your 70s or your 80s. Moving can become absolutely overwhelming, even if you have some money. Now, imagine for those who don't have any money, who have children in our schools, who are working near jobs, can't afford to travel long distances to jobs that require them to be on time or be on the clock. These are heavy considerations and heavy threats without just cause. Delegate Wilkins, is there anything else about just cause? We know that you've tried this approach each year with some success, getting recognition for it. What happened this year and what does it look like in the future?
So this year was very important for the bill. It was part of the priorities of the Renters United Maryland Coalition, which includes CASA and other really critical organizations. Jews United for Justice, thank you for your support. And I think that we really continue to build the momentum. Thank you to Renters Alliance board members like Chris Perry, Matt Losack was there. We had support from Baltimore City Mayor. We had council members from Howard County, from Prince George's County. We really demonstrated this session the statewide support for this legislation, which is so important. And we had a great hearing on the bill. And, it's a bill that, because this is the first session of a new term, so we have a lot of new members. So this session was really critical in making sure that we introduced the bill in a really strong form. And there was a lot of support in the committee. So unfortunately, the bill did not end up getting a vote this year, but there are some changes that are happening in the legislature, new leadership, and things like that, where we think that we'll hopefully have a shot and have a chance in being able to move it in the future. So stay tuned, continue to push, reach out to your members and let them know, your state legislative members, let them know that you support this bill. And I think that we have a great chance of getting it passed in 2024. And we'll keep pushing as long as it takes.
You're right. Thank you. Specifically, we should say that the chair of the committee that oversees housing, who has opposed this bill, is moving on. And so that we will see new leadership in that committee. That's the Environment and Transportation Committee. Am I right, Delegate Wilkins?
Yes.
Environment and Transportation Committee. So we'll see some movement there. That's a committee, by the way, that Delegate Vaughn Stewart, who's just joined us, also sits on, who's a terrific voice on this issue and many other issues. So that's one thing. And we also have some time to keep talking about this. The legislative education process and persuasion process does not start in January. It starts all year round. And so we have all the spring and summer and fall to educate, as Delegate Wilkins says, the new members, to remind the more senior members about how important this is, and also to work with our new governor to get his support. And also, Delegate Wilkins, this time you had support from the Senate?
Yes, the bill was introduced and cross-filed in the Senate. This is the first time that we had the ability to cross-file the legislation. So the senators heard it. It was actually a great bill hearing. So thank you to everyone who came out and testified. I stopped in over on the Senate side to check out the hearing, and it went really well. And so between the House and the Senate next year, we hope we'll be able to get a vote on either or both of the bills that we introduce. So thank you again.
And I also want to point out proudly that we are the leading co-founder of Renters United Maryland with the Public Justice Center. And we have also managed to get a whole lot more alliances on this bill, even beyond Renters United Maryland. As Delegate Wilkins pointed out, we had, I believe, the Maryland Association of Counties also supported this bill. County Executive Mark Elrich personally testified in support of this bill, as did members of our county council. And of course, thanks to really the efforts of Delegate Wilkins and Vaughn Stewart and other allies of ours in our state delegation, since we started this, particularly with Delegate Wilkins' leadership, for the first time in state history and certainly Montgomery County history, we got the vast majority of our county delegation to support this bill. There was a time over a decade ago when we brought fundamental renters' rights to the attention of the county council and the delegation. And I can tell you, we were laughed at, that these things would never happen. In that time, we have passed some legislation with our county. We have passed the county delegation support to now allow Delegate Wilkins to go forward with this bill to the General Assembly. And so our efforts to draw attention to these needs and issues is getting broader and broader support. Yeah. And of course, it's good to have talent.
And Matt, if I can just jump in, and I'd like to hand it over to Delegate Stewart. I was remiss in not mentioning a really critical bill that actually was my bill that passed into law. We're waiting on the governor to sign it, but very excited for him to do that. We passed legislation this session to put $10 million. And this was a bill that I sponsored with Delegate Stewart. It was a true team effort. So thank you so much, Delegate Stewart. It was a Wilkins Stewart bill. We passed legislation to put $10 million into a state voucher program. You're probably familiar with the federal voucher program, which is oversubscribed and there's a long waiting list. Our state program will take a look at the folks on the waiting list and prioritize our seniors, prioritize veterans, homeless individuals, families with children, and utilize those state funds to take them off the wait list and provide them with state funds for a voucher for housing. So that is a first in the nation, really landmark legislation, and we are excited about the passage of that bill and the work that was done with MMHA, which is the Multi-Family Housing Association, which we're usually on the opposite side with, but we worked together on this bill. And also want to thank the chairman of the Budget and Tax Committee, Guy Gazzone, who helped ensure that this bill passed and cross-filed. So with that, those are all of my comments. And thank you again, everyone. And thank you so much, Delegate Stewart, for all of your partnership and for supporting and championing renters' rights as well.
So is it the Wilkins Stewart bill or the Stewart Wilkins bill? Depends on
either one. Either one.
Before we
just trying to make some trouble. Go ahead, Pat.
Hi, before we move on, I was just wondering, we got one of our listeners want to know if they are asked to leave, just like the bill you described, how does that impact further rent? Does anybody have any answers about if once they move on to get other rental properties, will this affect how they are viewed as a renter?
Let me just quickly add, Pat, if you receive a notice to vacate and you move, there is no consequence to you.
Okay.
And Vaughn Stewart, our delegate, is also a lawyer. You can concur if I'm wrong. But if you are evicted or you go to court and there's a judgment against you, then you may face some problems because that will be on your record.
Okay.
So just keep that in mind. And also, Delegate Wilkins, I want to point out that the licensing bill that you referred to earlier, we had Senator Shelley Heddleman on our last Renter Town Hall. She was the lead sponsor of that bill, and we are very grateful for her leadership, as well as her coming on to our Renter Town Hall all the way from Baltimore. But we applaud her work as well. So with that, then it is my honor, even though he is fading in and out of the Russian satellite here, Delegate Vaughn Stewart, who is also a board member of the Renters Alliance, the father of a second Stewart, and doesn't look quite as exhausted as he probably is, but he has been a champion for renters as well, has a million stories to tell about that, but we're grateful to have you here tonight to tell about the bill that you've been working on, knowing that all of these bill processes are lengthy and arduous, as are the wheels of justice. But welcome, Delegate Vaughn Stewart.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's been awesome to be with everyone. As always, I appreciate the invitation and any opportunity to have to talk about the fight to make life a little bit more dignified and just for all the renters, not only in Montgomery County, but throughout the state. And I just, first of all, let me say that the excellent second in the nation voucher bill, only after New Jersey, that Delegate Wilkins described, is really, I think, going to be a huge, huge success. And I think it was a huge, huge victory. But it was indeed the Wilkins Stewart bill. And I am very proud to even be mentioned in the same breath as Delegate Wilkins, who is truly an amazing leader in Annapolis and an inspiration to me, and really a mentor for me and many other people who came in 2018 and later in the General Assembly. She wears like 7 different hats in Annapolis, and she wears them all amazingly. But it's awesome to be with everyone. So first, I would just echo, what I heard a little bit there on the back end, both Janelle and Matt talk about, which is that there's been a lot of movement on these issues broadly. So even though some of the updates I'm going to give here are not like the rosiest, sunshine and rainbows updates of all time, I do think it's important to take them in the context, which is that 6, 7, 8, 10, certainly 15, 20 years ago, the idea that you would promote pro-tenant legislation in Annapolis was indeed laughable. And in fact, the opposite was more likely to be the case, which is that up-and-coming legislators who were seen as, rising stars or, leadership material, it was actually much more likely that they would be sponsoring pro-landlord legislation that would move Maryland in that opposite direction than what you see now, which is that leaders like Delegate Wilkins sponsoring, tenant bill after tenant bill. And that's the norm. And now, the environment in Annapolis is that it would be unheard of. It would be unthinkable almost for a Democrat to put in, maybe with a couple of exceptions, to put in a bill that is anti-renter. And so we've come a long way, and I think it's a tribute to the Montgomery County Renters Alliance and a lot of allies to keep up that fight and to raise the voices of regular people up and to lift up the average renter in the state who, whether or not they make $5,000 a year or $500,000 a year, deserves a dignified, safe, affordable place to live. And in that vein, I introduced a bill this session called the Tenant Safety Act. A number of you probably are familiar with this bill, but basically the idea is that everyone in Maryland already, it's existing law, everyone in Maryland is guaranteed the right to a safe and habitable home. That's been the law. That's the law in every state. But it's exceedingly difficult for individual tenants to enforce that right against usually their much more powerful landlords. And the reason is because in order to do that, in order to basically force your landlord to make repairs, even when those repairs are to serious, dangerous defects that imminently threaten your health and safety. We're talking about serious stuff, folks, for example, with disabilities who can't go down the elevator, people that don't have heat in the winter or AC in the summer. We're talking about extremely toxic mold. We're talking about children waking up with rats crawling around at their feet as they try to get their clothes on to go to school. We know that our neighbors are living in these conditions. Thousands and thousands of our neighbors are dealing with these conditions every day. And it's way too difficult for them to enforce their existing rights, to force their landlord to get off their ass and actually fix the property that they own. And my bill would have made it slightly more easy for tenants to enforce those rights, to live in a safe and healthy place. And it did so by essentially allowing tenants for the first time to sue as a group under Maryland's rent escrow law. Rent escrow is a little bit of a complex formula. It sounds more complex probably than it really is, but essentially the idea of rent escrow, as I'm sure a lot of y'all know, is that you pay your rent rather than paying it to your landlord. You allege that your landlord is not keeping up the property. You usually have to give them notice and a reasonable opportunity to fix it. So if a month or two goes by, they haven't fixed the problem, well, then you can file a rent escrow action. You pay your rent instead of to the landlord, and you pay it to the court. The court opens up essentially what's called an escrow account, hence rent escrow. You pay it in, and then you essentially have to prove a number of different things in court in order to force your landlord to fix the problem. Tenants rarely win, but when they do, the landlord only is required to fix the problem in that one unit. So even if there's mold throughout a building, everybody knows it, or there's rat infestation throughout a building and everyone knows it, when one plaintiff jumps through all those hoops and hurdles to get a rare victory, the remedy is that the landlord only needs to remedy that one unit. So as long as they put some sticky traps up or remove the mold from that one shower, they're in compliance, even though every other unit surrounding the prevailing plaintiff in the case has the exact same problem. So instead of having to miss work and file 10 different, 15 different, 20 different suits, the bill would have enabled that group of tenants to sue as a group, to make it easier for them to, for example, join the lawsuit, get a remedy, get their unit fixed without having, for example, to miss work to do so. This was only the second year that we put the bill in. Honestly, I have to admit that my hopes were not enormously high. As y'all know from the discussion in Just Cause, it can take years and years. Actually, it was just thinking the other day, I tweeted about this, but Senator Ben Cardin, who just announced his retirement a couple of days ago, he first won office, I believe, in 1968 for the House of Delegates. So I believe his first session was 1966, actually. I think his first session was 1967. Anyway, you can fact check me on that. But his first bill was actually to create a housing code, to basically create minimum livability standards for units in Maryland. It was his first bill as a delegate. And he said at the time that it would be a heavy lift, and he was right. That bill did not pass. We did not enact livability standards in Maryland until 1986, his last year as a delegate, when he actually was serving as Speaker of the Maryland House before he left to go to Congress. So it took 20 years, took 2 decades for that bill to pass. And so legislation can take a long time, and my hopes, like delegate Cardin's were back then, were not enormously high. But even in its second year, we were able to get the bill out of the House of Delegates. And it went over to the Senate. And we did have a Senate cross-file in Alonzo Washington, who fought really hard for the bill over in the Judicial Proceedings Committee. But unfortunately, we couldn't get it out. It was a matter of first impression for them. The bill was not cross-filed last year, and they had a lot of questions and unfortunately a lot of concerns. The judiciary actually testifies on bills in Annapolis. Like, the judges get together and decide what their position on bills are. They did not like the bill, to say the least. And so they sort of muddied the waters enough, and we weren't able to get it out. But hopefully we can build off the momentum from this session. I'm going to be meeting with all the judges. I'm going to be meeting with all the stakeholders over the summer and over the fall to maybe try to compromise even more on the bill to try to get something out. So stay tuned on that. But I do think that it was kind of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back situation, where clearly I think the question is a matter of when and not if we're going to find a way to make it easier for essentially tenants to force landlords to do their jobs. The second quick update I was going to give, another sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back sort of situation, is that we benefited from a lot of federal largesse in the midst of the pandemic as it pertained to the rental assistance program. The state of Maryland got something like $780 million of rental assistance money, which kept tens of thousands of Marylanders in their homes when they would have otherwise been kicked out onto the street. And the renter advocates and Renters United and a number of other different groups, including the Renters Alliance, push for the state to essentially pick up the tab for the federal government, essentially backing out and stepping away from any longer providing money to states to run the program. And unfortunately, no money at all, certainly not the amount that the advocates wanted. No money at all was included in the governor's budget, and no money at all was included in the House budget, and no money at all was included in the Senate budget. Fortunately, there was enough advocate pressure in the wake of the Senate passing a budget, that when the House and Senate went into a conference committee to talk about the issue, we were able to scrape out a limited sum, but $2 million in rental assistance. So nowhere near the amount that we got from the federal government, nowhere near the amount that we need to keep everyone who is struggling to remain in their homes. But at the end of the day, it's still going to help a few hundred households who otherwise would have been evicted. And given how dire the circumstances looked, a lot of us had basically given up in those waning days of session that we were going to get anything. Even the $2 million, I mean, I think, first of all, will help families, but I think even maybe more, or not more significantly, but also significantly, it shows the power that when we come together, the renter community and the renter advocacy community can have. Because in Annapolis, it's just a very rare event for a line item in the budget to not be in the governor's budget, to not be in the House budget, the initial House budget, and not be in the initial Senate budget, and still make it out in the final budget. I'm not on the appropriations committee, but from what I understand, it's virtually unheard of for that sort of thing to happen. And so it does speak to our collective power that when we band together, when we step up, when we make sure that Janelle and I's colleagues hear all of our voices, we can make an impact and we can overcome the power of the landlord lobby. And so we're going to have to keep doing that on a number of these issues. We need more money for rental assistance. We need safer homes. We need just cause eviction. We need rent control. And so we're going to have to keep fighting to get it. No one's going to just hand it to us easily, but I'm thrilled to be in the fight with all of y'all, and I'm happy to see everybody tonight.
And we are so lucky to have you in the fight with us, smart as you are, and a good papa. But I know that Delegate Wilkins can't stay with us much longer. She's off like a good politician to her next event. But we want to thank her for joining us. But Delegate Stewart, if you could stay for another few minutes, I have some more questions about what you're talking about, and also some context which many people don't realize. In 2007, when we started this sort of momentum, by Delegate Wilkins, thank you. when we started this momentum with renters' rights, 23% of our region lived in rental housing. Now we're looking at nearly 40% of folks living in rental housing, and not just as a station on the way to owning, but as a permanent way of life. And as Delegate Stewart points out, housing is not just something the same as beer and cigarettes and fancy shoes, but is actually central to community health, welfare, and prosperity. And when people live in unstable housing, we have costs that go well beyond the harm done to an individual family or an individual who has to move. So we're talking about a lot of people in the state of Maryland. We are concerned that we are seeing an increasing number of evictions taking place statewide. According to the Eviction Lab out of Princeton University, Maryland is the #1 state in the United States for eviction filings. And that is a very disturbing figure. So even may not be the #1 in evictions, but the #1 in eviction filings, partly because our eviction filing fee is so low. But we still have a culture out there from the landlord developer industry that files systematically when they want to get rid of people. And so we need to start looking at that too. We're grateful for the $2 million, but given the numbers of people that we're talking about, it's still just a tiny percentage. And so that fighting has to continue. But without rent stabilization, as Delegate Stewart points out, what we're doing is providing public dollars to pay landlords to increase their profits. So we're going to have to look at some kind of bookend to how we look at renter stability holistically, not just on an individual basis. Delegate Stewart, also, you mentioned the rent escrow situation with your bill, the Tenant Safety Act. How easy is it for a tenant to file a rent escrow in a situation like that?
Well, it's not easy at all. There are a number of different hoops already under existing law, or even if my bill had passed, there's still so many, I guess, what folks on the other side would call safeguards, but what I would call hurdles that landlords have to do. So, I mean, first of all, you got to recognize the problem. Second, you got to notify your landlord. Third, you have to allow a reasonable time to pass before you can even think about doing anything. Then you've got to file this action, which means that either you have to represent yourself, which almost never works, or you've got to hire an attorney, which is very expensive. And attorneys, plaintiffs' attorneys in these cases, tenant attorneys, are not generally going to be able to collect attorney's fees. In other words, the landlord defendants are generally not going to be able to be forced to pay for the tenant's attorney's fees, which means the incentive for these tenant attorneys to take on the case, if they don't work at legal aid or some sort of public funded operation, are basically none. So it's going to be extremely difficult to find an attorney. Then you've got to find time, presumably off from work, which very few employers are going to allow you to do. Like, oh yeah, I need to take Tuesday off to sue my landlord. That's not really going to go over very well for most employers. So not only you got to either hire an attorney, you got to understand the rules yourself well enough, if you can hire an attorney to represent yourself pro se. Then you've got to find time off, put this complaint in to testify, maybe to present evidence yourself, like photos or video evidence. Then the landlord can make a number of defenses that you have to overcome. So, for example, the landlord may argue that you caused the problem yourself, and you've got to somehow prove you did it. Or the landlord may argue that you didn't allow them access to the room when they wanted to fix it, and therefore that's why they couldn't fix it. And that can be a really difficult thing to combat too, because if the landlord says, hey, I've stopped by your place at 10:30 p.m. to fix the mold, and when I knocked on the door, nobody answered. So that's my defense. I'm not liable. So there are a number of different tricks. And remember, in almost all situations, the landlord will be represented by some sort of counsel and will be able to make these claims. So even after you've defeated all these defenses and you've made this affirmative, what attorneys call a prima facie case, basically all the initial stuff you have to prove, you prove, then and only then does the court even open up an escrow account for you to pay into. So these are tenants who are paying their rent. These aren't people that are trying to landlord folks sometimes argue, somehow in bad faith try to get out of paying their rent by filing actions in court. On the contrary, these people in the rent escrow process are paying their rent, and they're jumping through myriad hoops just to get their landlords to fix a dangerous issue. You know, I mean, a lot of times these folks are parents of young children and they're paying their rent, they're paying customers. They just want a service for what they pay for. They just want the landlord to do their job. And that's their right under Maryland law. They have a right to safe housing. And yet, in order to actually enforce the right, we make them, you know, go through this super arduous kind of maze of bureaucracy.
And it's impossible for them. It's such a rare case. Justice and habitability and quality, affordable, stable homes that are well maintained should not be extraordinary. And I have to say also, Delegate Stewart-Vaughan, getting it through the General Assembly and over to the Senate, first time out, is somewhat amazing. And I think it is a real testament to your skill as a legislator and a leader, and your credibility that you've built up through your experience in the Maryland General Assembly.
Well, I appreciate that. I'll just briefly mention that, you know, actually, you know, the Speaker and actually Chairman Barbe, who was mentioned, and they both on this bill really stepped up and had my back. And I think just kind of immediately got it, you know, like they weren't super familiar with the bill before the session or really the entire rent escrow process. And they both, you know, sort of after hearing the pitch that I just gave you, they both got it. I mean, I think people viscerally understand that there is an injustice out there when tens of thousands of our neighbors are just living in these deplorable conditions that none of us would want our own family members as legislators. I mean, there are no legislators who would allow their mom, you know, to spend one night with rodents, you know, to spend one night with toxic mold giving her asthma. And yet here we are as legislators going year after year, essentially abiding this status quo. And so I think really the leadership in the House, more than my own skills, deserve credit, because I think they got this and they really pushed it through, despite a lot of folks sort of screaming and saying, oh, it's so bad, and oh, it's not ready for prime time and all this kind of stuff in the waning hours. They really rammed it through. And so that makes me hopeful for, you know, next session.
Well, and we're hopeful and behind you too, and we'll obviously do our best to support it. I should also point out that this is not an issue only of what we would call slums. We have seen these issues in middle and upper middle class apartment communities as well. As I say, we were at the Enclave in Silver Spring this weekend. We saw photographs, and personally, since my staff and I walked door to door, delivering invitations to our community meeting and inspecting the building ourselves, and we saw the floors covered in rat feces, doors that had locks that were broken so that anyone could enter the building at any time. We've seen shootings there. I've been there when just right after a shooting where the walls were covered with bullet marks. We've seen a problem with folks coming in from the outside and sleeping on top of the washers and dryers, uninvited. Sexual assaults and other crime issues in the community, broken lighting, broken elevators, and of course, other types of infestations of mold and so on. And that used to be considered a luxury building in Montgomery County. So the ability of tenants to seek enforcement and redress would be so much supported by Delegate Stewart's Tenant Safety Act. And as I say, I've made as much progress this year out of the box. We're hoping we could do a lot better next time around. I also want to add that state support is one level, but we also have county support too. And we are hoping to work closer with the Department of Housing and Community Affairs. We had hoped to have a code inspector on today, but she is pulled in another direction with a meeting that she's required to be at. But they are inspecting, and we want to give them as much teeth as possible so that when they do inspections and see something is wrong, a code violation, that they can make sure that that code violation is handled in a reasonable period of time, handled effectively, and put away. Right now, we see the same code violations happening again and again at certain apartment communities. We see finally when the code department decides, and we ask them to do this more aggressively, and they might start doing that, fining them $500 or $1,000 for every violation. But then if the county takes the landlord to court, the fine is struck down to a minimal amount if the landlord at the last minute fixes the problem. So what Delegate Stewart is talking about is fixing a larger systemic problem of local and statewide enforcement of habitable quality living spaces for tenants. Do we have any questions or concerns of staff or from our audience for Delegate Stewart?
Well, I think one of the questions is if a tenant discovers that their property is not licensed, what is the next step for them? I don't know if Delegate Stewart can answer that or
Well,
Matt.
I mean, I think that the bill essentially says that landlords cannot, the bill I think that Delegate Wilkins was talking about before I hopped on, talks to that basically says that landlords cannot avail themselves of the eviction court process if they themselves don't have clean hands, as we would say in the law, which is that you've got to be up to the law. You've got to be a law-abiding landlord, including having a license before you can utilize the court system to kick someone out of their house. And so if you find out that your landlord is unlicensed and they're evicting you, then you should raise the law in your defense, because they cannot use the court system now once the law goes into effect, which is, I think, is either July 1 or October 1. So if your landlord's evicting you now, you got to wait for the law to go into effect. If your landlord evicts you in the fall or in the winter, you can use that as a defense. If you're not going through the eviction process, but you're noticing that your landlord is not licensed and you live in a county, in Montgomery County, the licensing laws are a little tricky. But if you suspect that you're in Montgomery County and your landlord is not licensed and is in violation of county law, then you should contact DHCA with that complaint and hope that they will force them to it looks like, let's see, someone posted a link to code enforcement complaint filing earlier. Yeah, now we got a link to DHCA. So yeah, if you're doing this sort of proactively and you're not really fearing eviction necessarily, but you're just kind of doing this proactively, you can lodge a complaint if you think that your landlord is violating either licensing or any other kind of law.
Yes, thank you, Janice. It is a tricky program, so brace yourselves to have 2 aspirin and a cocktail. But if you go online to eProperties from the Department of Housing and Community Affairs, you'll see 2 boxes. One is the address and one is the community name. Sometimes only the address works, sometimes only the community name works, sometimes they both work. Sometimes it's not the full address. If you put 1001 Spring, it might work better than 1001 Spring Street. So you have to play with it a little bit. But if you put in a combination or a single part of your community or the community that you're concerned about, the code inspection information will come up, the landlord tenant inspection information will come up, and the licensing information will come up. So you should be able to determine if your property is licensed. And if that fails, you can always call the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs or DHCA in general by calling 311 and saying that you have a concern as to whether or not your landlord is licensed. So that law, by the way, applies to a tenant holding over, it applies to failure to pay rent, and it applies to breach of lease. It does not apply to wrongful detainer, which means if you're a squatter, basically, you're not supposed to be there in the first place, then that's a different story. But for genuine tenants who have leases, as Delegate Stewart points out, we don't want a landlord who is in non-compliance with the licensing law to come to court with dirty hands and utilize tax paid for systems to get their rights while not ensuring that they're in compliance with the law that we all must abide by. So a very important piece of legislation. Anything else for Delegate Stewart? All right, well, not seeing anything, then let me say thank you very much to my friend and our state delegate, our board member, and a real champion in Annapolis. We thank you for your service and your leadership. We will track it. We welcome you back to give us updates and reports. And we thank you for being at the front of the fight. So off you go to put the kids to bed.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks, Matt. Great to be with everyone. Really appreciate the opportunity as always to spend a little time with y'all.
Thank you. All right. I want to just briefly go through a couple of things that we always go through with these renter town halls. For those of you who are running into difficulty with your landlord over something like coming into your apartment without notice, maintenance issues where you're not getting a response from the landlord, where you think your lease is being violated, where you're paying for services that you're not getting or amenities that you're not getting, if you feel that your ledger is inaccurate, that you're getting charged for things that you shouldn't be charged for, if you feel that the accounting is not being correct, if you feel that you're being abused in some way from your landlord or property manager, these issues are handled by the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs. Obviously, the Renters Alliance believes, as does the county, that you need to give your landlord or property manager an opportunity to fix any problems. So your first station in a concern or a dispute is to go to the property manager or the landlord and say, hey, I've asked you to fix this and I need you to do it. Or you're not supposed to be coming into my home without at least 24 hours notice. And if it's an unreasonable 24 hours notice because you want to be in the apartment when they come in, to give you some kind of accommodation there. Go to them and see if you can work out and negotiate an accommodation or fix a problem. If, however, the landlord or the property manager is not responsive, as we saw at the Enclave recently, and it's only one example of many here in Montgomery County, unfortunately, where repeated requests for service are not made. In fact, tenants sometimes get threats of retaliation, and one tenant leader in this complex is being threatened with eviction for raising issues in the building, some very serious issues. Then the idea is to file a complaint with the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs. And one does that by either calling 311 and asking the 311 operator to connect you to an Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs inspector or investigator. And to do so, also asking them for a tracking number so that it doesn't disappear into the bureaucracy. They should give you a case number of some kind so that you know that you have proof that you made a complaint and can follow up and make sure that that complaint registers with the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs and that an investigator gets in touch with you. If you do all of that and don't get a response within a reasonable period of time, usually a couple or 3 days for an initial response, then contact us. We work with them all of the time and can help you track things down. That's the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs. Those are problems with leases, violations of your rights. If you have a maintenance issue that is broken appliances, broken locks on your doors, mold and vermin or mice, if there's a water leak or something, obviously, again, the first station you need to go to is your property manager or your landlord. There isn't a rich person who lives in a mansion on the Potomac that doesn't have mice and mold, broken appliances, and whatnot. These happen in every housing community, whether you're in a private house, a mansion, or in an apartment building. So seeing a mouse run across the floor does not mean that you have a nuclear problem. The difference is that if you live in your own house and you own your own house, you can resolve the problem yourself. If you're in an apartment community, you're relying on the property manager or the landlord to do their part and take care of that issue. So you go to the property manager or the landlord and say, hey, look, I've got mold coming out of my air conditioning vent and it's getting worse. And I need you to mitigate that. And after a few days, whatever is reasonable, depending on the severity of the issue, they need to fix it. And if they don't, Then your next level of escalation is to call the Code Enforcement Department. And code enforcement is also reachable through 311, but code handles building maintenance issues. So I think we put in the chat the link to the Code Department's complaint processes and to the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs, which is ulta.intake@montgomerycountymd.org. If you want to send them an email, ulta, O-L-T-A, .intake@montgomerycountymd.org. Now, we're not lawyers, but we do play them on TV from time to time. We have some pretty good expertise on landlord-tenant issues. If you have any questions or concerns that we'd be able to address, you can put them in the chat now, and we will give you our best advice. And if we don't have it, we'll refer you to where to go for that advice. So we'll give you a few minutes. If you have any questions or concerns, now would be the time.
There's one earlier just about general statistics on evictions and, and where that information might be available. I mean, I did want to throw out there that anything that goes to court is public. But then as far as the compiling of that eviction info, Matt, do you know if someone wanted to find out, like last quarter, for instance, I think they were asking where that might be available?
Yes, I have it right here. I'll put it in the chat. We receive, the Renters Alliance has a relationship with the Sheriff's Department and began a process of receiving eviction data and court data from the Sheriff's Department over a year ago. I'm going to put in the chat the eviction data since January. And let me explain a few things about it so that you understand the situation. All right, there it is. You'll see that the eviction process begins with, first you will receive probably a notice from your property manager or landlord says, hey, you're behind in your rent, the most common filing for eviction. Or some kind of notice about an issue if you're in violation of your lease, let's say, or a notice to vacate in 60 days. So you see some kind of notice. Then in order for the landlord to file in court, they have to issue you what's called a 10-day notice of summary ejectment. It used to be, getting that notice was something the Renters Alliance and others pushed for in Annapolis. It used to be that they could give you a notice the next day to go to court. You could receive a court summons without any notice that a court summons was coming. But you receive a very scary looking notice called a 10-day notice of summary ejectment. Looks like it comes from the court. Many people misunderstand that communication. It doesn't mean you're going to be evicted in 10 days. It means that the landlord is going to file with the court in 10 days. When the landlord files with the court will then issue you a summons to come to court for whatever the reason is, usually for failure to pay rent. And it will have a date on it for the court summons. Then you must show up at court unless you can get it dismissed beforehand by paying the rent or resolving the issue with the landlord, let's say. But then you go to court, and if you have a valid excuse, the defense, then maybe the judge will decide in your favor. But if the judge decides in favor of the landlord and has a judgment against you, then the next stage is for the landlord, having received a judgment against the tenant, to file what's known as a writ of restitution, meaning that the landlord wants to repossess the property, the apartment. When the landlord does that, and that's a very simple procedure, then the judge will take that writ of restitution and transfer it to the sheriff's office to then begin a process of scheduling an eviction. So then at that point, you will receive a notice on the door from the sheriff's office saying that your eviction is imminent. That's known as a red and white notice. It's a very scary notice on purpose. And it's telling you that eviction is coming in a matter of weeks. And one should prepare to deal with that. When the landlord cannot evict anybody themselves, they have to go through the court. They have to utilize the court process. And no landlord can come into your house and start moving your furniture or changing your locks or reducing any services until the eviction day, when the landlord or his or her staff come to your apartment with a sheriff. And then with the sheriff supervising, they can remove your furniture and belongings and put it on the street and change your locks. So that's how that happens. So you can see on here that in January, we had 554 writs filed. Many people will move out before the eviction takes place. So you'll see a substantial or take care of the issue, like pay the rent down before the sheriff arrives. If a tenant pays down the amount owed in a failure to pay rent case before the sheriff gets there, then the no eviction will take place. But say you'll see, and that happens in a majority of cases. So the actual evictions conducted from 554 was only 40, well, I should say not only, was 44 in January. But housing instability should be measured more than just by the actual evictions. These are the tip of the iceberg statistics. People who are receiving threatening notices, people who don't like or are getting abuse from their property manager or landlord may move out well before the court captures that information. So we see 554 writs in January, 557 in February, 810 in March. And now this looks like good news, but it's not. In April, 462, like it's declining. But what happened between last month and this month was that the court cut in half the number of court hearings in the housing process. So where they had twice as many housing sessions in court in March, now they have half that number. So you have to have judgments against tenants in order to file writs of restitution. But still, 462 with 91 evictions conducted is still a hefty number, and again, represents the tip of the iceberg of the kind of housing stability we're seeing as rents are skyrocketing in Montgomery County, and we're still seeing an epidemic of neglect and abuse of properties in many places throughout Montgomery County. Also want to throw in, if there are questions, staff, let me know. But I want to throw in that there are two bills that are still pending before the Montgomery County Council. One is the anti-rent gouging bill. I say that in quotation marks because it is calling for legitimizing a rent increase of over 12%. Obviously, we oppose that figure, but it also includes some other good things like additional funding for renter outreach and education, something that we do, as well as building new affordable housing, but it doesn't do much for keeping your rents down. The other bill is called the Home Act, and that would limit rents to 3%, rent increases to 3%, and include some other provisions which we support. The anti-rent gouging bill does not cover small landlords. So that's a lot of people in Montgomery County, tens of thousands who live in apartments that are owned by small landlords. The Home Act covers all licensed landlords at 3%. We don't think either bill is going to pass without a compromise. So we are having an ongoing dialogue here at the Renters Alliance. We had a community meeting at the Silver Spring Civic Center. We've had members who sponsored both bills on these calls to discuss these issues. Our next Renter Town Hall on May 24th will include the lead sponsor for the anti-rent gouging bill, Council Member Andrew Friedson. And also we'll have a special guest, the new Attorney General for the state of Maryland, Anthony Brown, who will come on to tell us what his office is doing to protect renters, as well as his special interest in enforcing law surrounding and protecting people against discrimination in rental housing. Any other questions in the chat, folks?
Yeah, I was going to address, while my son shows y'all this, I was going to address a question from Gary that said, if the landlord is unlicensed, how does he evict a tenant? What protection does a tenant have against unlawful tactics? I was going to just mention for my part, I think on the yellow summons that comes when they're bringing someone to court for at least a failure to pay rent, there is a place where it says, put your rental license number here, so we know you can go forward. So they're supposed to put it on the summons, but there are CASA, Homeless Persons Representation Project, HPRP, and Legal Aid all should have, they're working together to have attorneys down at the courthouse. So if you have a suspicion your landlord is unlicensed, I would flag one of them down. There's usually an announcement at the beginning of the docket about how to talk to them.
Yeah, and let me throw one bit of cold water on this too. That bill passed the House and the Senate, but it has not been signed by the governor yet. We expect that to happen any week now, but until the governor signs it, it's not law yet. So keep that in mind, even though I think there are still valid defenses, and I think that there are judges who would listen to that as the defense, but it's not the law of the land.
Perhaps it was closing a loophole. So for some cases, it's already, you can raise that defense. So definitely flag, someone down, depending on the case type.
All right, anything else? Well, with that, then, I want to thank our state delegates and board members, Janelle Wilkins and Vaughn Stewart. They are terrific. I can't say enough good things about them. We are so lucky to have them in Annapolis. And we have a lot others who are not on our Renters Alliance board, but are also great friends of ours in the state delegation and the state Senate, who have been working with us closely, including Will Smith, Senator Will Smith from District 20, who is the chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee, and his vice chair, Jeff Waldstreicher, all have been supporters of the renters movement. So we are expecting great things out of our county delegation and the delegation's leadership in Annapolis, and our friends in other parts of the state who are becoming more and more engaged in the renters' rights movement. The Renters Alliance is a very reasonable organization in this regard. We don't want to demonize good landlords. There are responsible landlords out there doing the right thing. We have no problem with a landlord maintaining their profit margin or keeping up with legitimate expenses. We just oppose excessive rent increases that ignore the responsibility we believe landlords have to provide stable, quality, affordable housing and permanent housing to our community. Without that, we put at risk the stability, health, and welfare of our communities and the prosperity of our communities. So with that, I want to thank everybody, my staff, of course, David and Pat and Malek, and my board treasurer, Josh Fisher. Thank you all for coming this evening. Our next Renter Town Hall again is May 24th. We look forward to seeing everybody there. Thank you, everybody.